All right, I think we're ready to get started. Thank you everyone for your patience. Welcome to the 2022 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Courtney Collins. I'm the Assistant Director at the Environmental Law Center here at Vermont Law School. We are pleased to welcome viewers to our presentation today. Each talk is worth one Vermont CLE credit, so you can sign the attendance roster at the back of the room by the door and keep track of which talks you attend for your records. Please hold your questions and we'll have time for Q&A after today's presentation. For those of you watching online on YouTube or Facebook, feel free to leave a question in the chat box. And today we are pleased to welcome Professor Madhavi Venkatesan. Professor Venkatesan teaches in Vermont Law School's online program. She has published several economics textbooks. She has also contributed to the literature on the relationship between culture, sustainability, and economics, addressing the relationship between economic systems and cultural convergence. In 2016, Professor Venkatesan established the Sustainable Practices, a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to facilitate a culture of sustainability as defined by reducing the human-made impact to the planet and its ecosystems, and is the organization's executive director. Her academic interests include the integration of sustainability into the economics curriculum. She has been active in promoting education and stakeholder engagement to incorporate ethics into the existing economic framework, and her written work has largely focused on these topics as a catalyst to promoting sustainability. Professor Venkatesan is the editor-in-chief of Sustainability and Climate Change, of which we have the last printed copy available to those of us here today. She earned her doctorate, master's, and bachelor's degrees in economics from Vanderbilt University, a master's from Harvard University, and a MELP degree from Vermont Law School. Today, she will present Economics and Climate Change, the Significance of Context and Interpretation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Venkatesan.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Oftentimes, economics is neglected in the entire discussion of sustainability, and it's often because people are too concerned with thinking about or looking at or analyzing the issues that they see, rather than actually thinking about maybe a little deeper as to why those issues are occurring. And I'm going to hopefully provide you with some points that you can think about afterwards. The number one thing I'd like you to start to think about, even as we start, is how much the economic system influences your day-to-day behavior and how much you actually know about the economic system. Unfortunately, the problem in this society is that the majority of people don't understand basic economics. Economic literacy is a fundamental issue. And so hopefully we'll talk about that to start. And in doing so, we'll be able to see very clearly and very simply the direct relationship between economics and climate change. So these are a couple quotes that I think are very worthwhile looking at. One is a very old quote. One is coming from the Wealth of Nations in the 18th century. To found a great empire for the sole purpose of raising up a people of customers may at first sight appear a project fit only for a nation of shopkeepers. It is, however, a project altogether unfit for a nation of shopkeepers, but extremely fit for a nation whose government is influenced by shopkeepers. And that comes from the Wealth of Nations. Unfortunately, that's considered to be the Bible, so to speak, of modern economic thought or modern economic theory. What people often misunderstand is that Adam Smith can't really be completely understood without reading his first book, which is A Theory of Moral Sentiments. Economics is a moral philosophical discipline, and hopefully what I'll discuss with you today is the primary missing constraint in our economic system is the constraint of conscience. In some way, shape, or form along the way, we dropped off the moral components, the moral underpinnings of our behavior, and delegated those to regulation, which is subject to interpretation. So the second quote here is, nations benefit from having an economically literate population because it improves the public's ability to comprehend and evaluate critical issues. This understanding is especially important in democracies that rely on the active support and involvement of its citizens. Now, this is so important to our discussion because unfortunately, the majority of the American public is economically illiterate. And if I were to ask people, just random people, what is economics? The first thing that almost everyone will say is it's about money. Economics has absolutely nothing to do with money. Money is a proxy for well-being. Fundamentally, our economic system is about well-being. It's about managing the well-being of people. Now, it may not be about managing everyone's well-being, and we'll talk about that very briefly. It could be just about certain people that are more important than others. But in the end, it's still well-being. What's important here to remember is that that was a primary focus. But to the point that we've quantified the discipline, we've made it the only focus as being income, or what we'll talk about as GDP growth, the proxies for underlying well-being. And you'll see how far removed they are from actual well-being shortly. So one of the areas that I like to focus on first when I start any of my lectures or classes when I have the opportunity to talk about sustainability is specifically to talk about what is the purpose of education. It's one of those words that we use all the time, and everybody assumes they understand what it means. But the reality is, again, it's just like economics itself. If I were to ask people, everybody would probably come up with a different definition. The purpose of education for some of us is solely about getting a job. So we weigh the consequences of the debt or the expense relative to the income we're going to generate. And I would say that's probably more aligned with the majority of people these days, because the idea of just getting educated for the sake of expanding your own mind is a luxury that many people cannot afford. COVID has taught us very clearly that we live in a society where people don't really have that expanse. Because when they didn't have external stimulus, they were getting depressed and were having very strenuous emotional issues, right? Very, very challenging times. Because the exercise of the mind to basically create its own entertainment has been sort of limited in our society. It's part of the consumerism that we are all a part of. We need external stimulus in order to feel somehow satiated or be able to get through our day. But we're not necessarily connected to anything. And so we'll hopefully talk about that a little bit. But these are some aspects of what education could be: tactical, political, cultural, obedience, critical engagement. For the purpose of our discussion, we're going to talk about education from the standpoint of culture. But what I want to really highlight to you is something you may not have thought about when you think about culture. So right now, let me just backtrack to literacy. So if we look right here, literacy is really important. But in terms of just requirements for economics courses, only 25 require students to take a course in economics to graduate. And more than likely, that's a very watered down course, because most people, when they think of economics, think of supply and demand and equilibrium, and they think of prices. But most people are not taught, or nor do they think about or contemplate, that prices themselves are very poor proxy for the true value of anything. All prices, which I will hopefully get to in a few minutes, I speak ahead of myself sometimes too, are inefficient. Because prices are an outcome of whoever is stronger, supply or demand. They're not based on symmetry of information. They're actually based on asymmetry in information. They are inherently exploitive. But this is part of the discussion that hopefully will lead to your thinking about some of these items later. So I'm not going to read this because I'm pretty sure it's been up long enough so you can read it. But basically what we're going to look at is, without economic literacy, without an understanding that prices are not efficient, without an understanding that I don't have symmetry of information, without an understanding that I've divested myself from my values when I make my consumption decisions or my investment decisions or who I vote for in office, I am part of the problem in this economic system. Oops. So the purpose of an economy, as I've already mentioned, is to promote well-being, happiness, and cooperation, community. The other question I often ask people is, are we naturally competitive or cooperative? And unfortunately, most people will say, we're naturally competitive. And then I'll say, well, are we naturally aggressive or passive? And I usually get the answer that we're naturally aggressive. Those are actually incorrect. We are naturally cooperative. We are only competitive when we are forced to be. And actually, the inherent definitional aspect of aggression versus passivity means that you, by definition, if you're aggressive, will drive out the evidence of passivity. So the lack of passivity in terms of its existence or being able to be seen doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a natural state. What it does mean is that the definition of aggression is what we need to be pointing to, because that's the only thing that's leaving evidence. So it's really an important aspect to think about. The other thing is to think about is when we look at economic theory and the way we've evolved over time, this is the exact same time when we have Darwinian evolution coming out. And we also have a very political bias towards science. So without actually critically engaging with this idea of survival of the fittest and the fact that in nature we're naturally competitive, we have allowed ourselves to just believe something without ever thinking about whether it really makes sense. So I'm hoping that you will start to think about that too, because most of these thoughts are not true. They have become true because what we've done as economists, we've endogenized them because our theoretical constructions of how the society that we live in works has actually become the way society works, if that makes sense. So, economics can be defined in a few different ways. I've mentioned earlier, the first definition I usually get is that it's about money, but it's a study of scarcity could be one, how people use resources and how they allocate resources, how they make decisions. It could be, I think it's the next slide, it's important. Our economic system in the United States is not a framework that's independent of us. It is our culture. So our economic operating system is our culture. So I'm going to ask you a question. If you don't have to raise hands, but just think about this for yourselves. How often do you think of shopping as an entertainment vehicle? How many of you have things in your closet that you've never worn with the tags on? How many of you, in spite of having many outfits to wear, maybe you've only worn 2 or 3 on a regular basis? These are cultural norms because consumer satisfaction, consumer satiation, consumer gratification is a norm. It's the only way an economy that's been dependent purely on production can continue to grow. This is a very important aspect to think about because it shows very clearly how we have taken a theoretical construct of human behavior related to self-gratification and endogenized it, made it into a real behavioral response to what we see around us. We do not question whether we need something. Our only focus is on what we want. And this is an important aspect because the constraint on the consumer is the consumer. And this is why economics is so tied to psychology. So the reason why I have a few of these pictures up is one aspect of our current economic system that a lot of people are not aware of is our current economic system in many ways, if you're interested, is born out of the slave trade. There is a great book called Slavery's Capitalism that's written by about, I don't know, I want to say 18 different academics. And it really highlights all the different attributes. Most people aren't even aware that the first mortgages were on human life. And the fact that we have established accounting techniques that we still maintain today based on the use of slavery in the past. This is really important because when we think about human beings, even today, and we think about marginal product of labor or workplace efficiency, it's based on non-humanizing the human so that they basically behave like a machine. And when you think about it, that is exactly what we were looking at when we looked at slavery. It was not about looking at this person as a human, but how much can I draw from this person for my own wealth creation? Many of these same attributes are not necessarily explicit, but they're implicit within our current economic system, which draws the question now that if the potential for machine sentience is coming into being, which recently some of you may have seen the article from The Guardian, this may actually create another set of issues. But looking here, the other thing that's really important is there was a recognition that if there was a connection to a slave as being as human as the person who was perpetrating what would be considered immoral behavior, then that person would have to feel at odds with their behavior. So the creation of the person as subhuman is also coming out of this. So race is an automatic outcome of our capitalism-based foundations. Race is a human construction, a social construction, and it's an American construction. So this is another part of this idea of dominion, right? When you look at this, this is a big hill of bison. Some of you may be very familiar with this photo. It's an old photo, but it ties very clearly to the idea of dominion of human life over all land life, right? part that's really interesting to me is in order to have dominion, you have to inherently be a steward, because otherwise you will cease to have anything to have dominion over. So either you believe that you can use whatever you want because the end of the earth will be coming, so it's justifiable, or you don't think that hard. You're not very critically engaged in your actions. Oops. This is just a standard picture of deforestation. This one actually ties to a lot of the talks that you've already seen in terms of the environmental value of natural resources. Up until the most present period of time when there's been a lot more debate about the growth rates, because typically we've used capital growth rates as being the growth rate that's attributed to deforestation. So let's say we think the natural growth rate of capital is 6%. We'd put that same attribution to a forest and chop it down, assuming that it's going to grow at 6% a year. Economists and those people engaged in ecological economics specifically have argued that we need a 0 or -% growth rate. Why? Because climate change is actually changing how animals and plants will respond in the natural world. The growth rates that we may have seen in the past may not necessarily be appropriate in the present or the future, which means if you have a 0, that means you're valuing the present in equal terms to the future. If you have a negative, you're valuing the future more because the cost in the present is higher. That makes sense? So you're basically doing what we would call a risk management calculation. You're calculating what you don't know, which is not what we do typically. So this all brings us to this particular piece of modern art, which is the human domination of the earth. Now, we live in a society where this is the case, and we all are complicit in it. Every single day, we do things that are completely at odds with our perception of personal social justice or environmental justice or other sensitivities that we claim to have. Some of this we do based on cognitive dissonance. We choose not to know what we don't know on purpose. We ignore it. We may have this information, but we just ignore it. We put it as though it's not something that we can either control or something that's really within our purview of action, or something even to the extent that we rationalize the significance away. So we'll talk about that very briefly. But all of these things, these pieces, tie directly to climate change. But the more important aspect is not climate change, but the human footprint on the planet. Because hopefully what you're starting to think about too is climate change is just one small sliver of the human footprint on the planet. If we only focus on that, thinking that that's the salve for the issues that we face, we will only continue, just like you push on a balloon, to cause a ripple effect on the other side of the balloon. So these are up here for one simple reason, as my prompt to remind you that I want to tell you about the concept of economics as religion itself. So these are some titles that have been coming out. The first 3 of them are obvious because they actually have religion in the title, and you can see that they're written about the economics discipline or economics framework as being a religion. Color of price may not necessarily be as clear, but that's just having to do with the racialization of religion in order to actually promote one particular perspective of what an economy can be. And this is sort of important, and I bring this up, and I'm going to ask you to sort of think with me about this, okay? Most of us, when we have gone through any kind of religious indoctrination, we unfortunately are limited by the very belief system or the system that we're knowledgeable about, and we can't help but judge any other framework based on that same framework. So it's hard sometimes to say, okay, if economics is a religion, then where's the church? Where's the Bible? Where are people worshiping? It's not the same. That's why we have these words that we use like cult and other types of words that we diminish other groups that don't necessarily have the same institutions and the same mechanisms of transmittal of religion. Well, I'll say this, and I'll give this just as food for thought. Just keeping a more open perspective, and if you're interested in looking at the social construction of religion, there's a great book by Craig Martin that I would highly recommend. But you look at it, it's very thin, it's a very easy read, but it really goes over the whole concept of social construction, but it also highlights very clearly how we are limited by the very social constructs that we have been brought up with. But if we look at economics, why do people go to college? Is vocational school looked upon in the same way as going to college? Does it make you as desirable a companion? If you can't make it in the economic system, do people want to be around you? Or are you sort of like an untouchable, sort of a cast off to the side of the society? When you're at your most vulnerable in our society, do people have compassion for you? Or is your vulnerability in and of itself the own damning element to you? It leaves you into a permanent trap. These are aspects of whether you're able to be a participant in the economic system, if we put a parallel to it as a religion. What is the purpose of your existence? We know that we have the rise of the nones today, which N-O-N-E-S means people who don't believe in any kind of religious basis in terms of formal religion. So they become more secularized, they claim to be spiritual. But if you ask people what the purpose of their existence is, most people cannot say anything except some sort of material item. Oh, I want to buy this house, or I want to get this car, or I have this desire to amass this amount of money so I can retire. But it's all based on those quantifiable elements that we talked about earlier in terms of how we define economics. Because that's how economics proxies our well-being. So the proxy for the well-being has actually become the purpose of our existence. I will invite you to think about that a little bit. Sit back and just think maybe over the course of the next couple of days. I mean, do you really have a purpose? Or is your purpose really just the proxy for why all this exists? And then finally, when we think about all of this here, and think of it as a religion, there are a few different schools of thought, and then there is a dominant school of thought, very much like you would have in terms of a religion as well. So the up-and-coming school of thought, which is perhaps more aligned with environmental perspectives, is ecological economics, which defines itself as being transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, all-encompassing, which if you believe economics is a culture, or economics influences culture, makes total sense. Economics is an embodiment of moral philosophy, religion, anthropology, history, political science, psychology. It is about what matters to you to make you happy and fulfilled as a human being in this one life that you will have. So I've been mentioning for a while the proxy is the goal. The proxy here, Y, is GDP. This is a very simple expenditure equation that you can actually calculate out yourself. This is what the Federal Reserve tracks indirectly, not directly. They track it through inflation and employment. So as employment increases, the GDP would increase. C is consumption expenditures. I is equal to investment expenditures. This is investment basically on the elements that will actually promote production. G is government expenditures. X minus M is exports minus imports. In the United States, C is about 70% of our GDP. So this should not be a surprise as to why we're such a consumption-driven economy. This is not the case when you look at China. G is much stronger. When you look at socialist economies, the G is much bigger. Consumption doesn't have to be the primary focus of an economy. It just happens to be our primary focus. In a couple of slides, I'm going to share with you something specific to the United States, but the thing you need to take into consideration here, we have the highest footprint pretty much in the world. And anywhere else in the world that has a high footprint, more than likely learned how to do it from us. This country consumes more than any other country on a per individual basis. And that's why climate change activism and climate change action needs to start here. People will also talk to you, I'm going to go slightly off tangent, about population and how sub-Saharan Africa and these other countries are having increased population. You have to look at population weighted by resource use. Population weighted by resource utilization would put all Western economies at a much higher footprint. So it's not about population, it's about how much you use. So the other part of our economy, as consumers takes off, is I am old enough to know when there was no cell phone. Okay. Cell phones came about when I was in graduate school. And they were this big, and the antenna was about that long. And I felt so excited that I had one, because I thought, now if I have an emergency, I'll have a way to call. Now it's not about an emergency, right? It's about constantly checking my emails as though somehow I'm going to get a message that's going to change and transform the whole world. which is not going to happen to any of us. But this is the addiction that it has created. It is a marketed demand economy. In other words, what I'm trying to say is our consumption is not even about us. It's about connecting to what makes us feel good. It's a psychological manipulation to get us to want things that we don't even need. And only with the cognizance of this can we have the potential to stop it. So I was looking for this particular slide and I couldn't find it. But this is what I would have liked to have had right here, is a picture of, because I wanted a cartoon. Obviously didn't want this real. I'll tell you what it is. Our economy is like somebody grabbing a dog by the tail and wagging it, forcing the dog to wag. We are told, and we buy into this because everybody else is doing it, that this is what we need to be happy, this is what we need. And once it hits a certain critical mass, you have to have it because then you can't function, right? But if we were to get out there and start to get people to get engaged, which right now we're at a very significant potential tipping point because there are a lot more people that know and understand this today than ever before, that something's got to change. You have the shared economy, you have minimalism, you have the tiny house movement, you have these basic things. It's difficult to tell if it's just a fad or if it's going to be something that's permanent, but it all has an impact to GDP because it reduces consumption. The more I share with you, the less I need for myself just to buy one item for me, right? So this is the part that's important. So if you think about it, you have a government, central bank and fiscal policy from the federal government level that are looking at the economy based on the culture that it has embedded into the system, which is that you're a consumer. And then all of a sudden you're saying, no, I don't really want to be a consumer because I'm looking around me and I'm seeing that the quality of my life is actually becoming lessened because of all this trash that I'm creating, and it's going in landfills and it's being burned and going in incinerators, and on top of it, I'm lessening my own human existence because of the creation of all these toxins that I'm breathing and drinking and eating. So right there you have this disconnect because the economy, in order for it to grow, has to have us continue to consume. The moment you start to recognize and you develop a movement where people say, no, I want to be more thoughtful with my consumption. I don't want to create slave situations in the Congo so that I can have cell phones every 2 years. You're forcing the culture to change. You're forcing the culture here on the ground level to change. That could potentially cause the economy to change. So instead of having a top-down approach, perhaps the time is ripe for a bottom-up approach. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So the reason why some of these things are happening is because if we look, we have gross domestic product, which has been growing over time because that is our focus. But then if you look at income inequality in the United States specifically, but globally as well, has been increasing with every major financial or other externalized event that has been a shock to the economy. Any reason why you would think that would be happening? I bet when I share it with you, it will make total sense. If I have enough and I'm living paycheck to paycheck, which is what most people do in this country, and most people do probably all over the world, and a shock happens, the first thing I want to do is make sure I can feed my family. So I'm going to try to liquidate what assets I can. But I'm not the only one because unfortunately the pool of people in that position are fairly large. What does that do to prices? It puts a downward price pressure on it because the supply is higher. I'm making an oversimplified example, but I think the point will hold true with almost any situation if we were to have the time to evaluate it. So I'm selling to those people who actually have the financial liquidity in the crisis, who are already well off. They can come in and buy it cheap, right? So when we recover, I have less, and the person who bought my assets at an inexpensive price, less than market value, not only is able to make that market value, but also the rebound in value, right? So each successive shock leaves greater and greater wealth disparities, income disparities as well. So this is an important aspect to take into consideration. So things are not working. In other words, this idea that somehow GDP growth is going to lead to everyone's system, everyone's pocketbook getting better and everybody's life getting better isn't working. It's not happening in the United States and it's not happening in other countries. And the number one reason we have some evidence as to why it's not happening in those countries where we see fast fashion as being an issue and other types of export and pollution-based markets on which we're polluting there and importing here, it's because the countries themselves are using their own people as commodities in the production process. So in the United States, we have some amount of ability to organize labor, to promote the better working conditions for people. But if you remove that ability, if regulatorily people cannot organize, cannot protect themselves, you have the Rana Plaza incident in Bangladesh, so many other, Foxconn in China, so many situations that are happening and happening even now that we don't know about. And it's because of a failure for those people and their welfare, their well-being to matter. So this is the perfect time for us to sit back and say something to ourselves. We said that GDP was a proxy, potential proxy. At its creation, GDP was never meant to be a proxy for anything. It was just meant to be an evaluation of production. But we've made it into a proxy for well-being under the assumption that more people working means that more people will have income. More people having income means that they can buy the basic things that they need to have a decent life. But it's not working, right? You have growing GDP, and you have less people being able to have a decent life. You have lower well-being today on a global scale. So when I was talking about the tail wagging the dog, that's another evidence as to why we need a change. We need an indicator that is a better proxy for our well-being. The quantifiable elements of life are easy because math is much easier than actually talking to another person. Perhaps maybe that's one of the disconnects that we have in our society. If we really want to solve the problems, we cannot just look at what we observe and quantify it to find a solution. We need to take the time to understand how those problems have manifested in people, affected them, and work with them so that they can be the kind of future society that we wish and aspire to have. Well-being. Okay, so these are aspects of externalities that occur with GDP growth. Pollution in the waters causing fish to die, oil spills, plastic and other types of garbage washing ashore, pollutants in the atmosphere. All of these are externalized costs. These all exist and they all occur, I will argue, because instead of conscience being our constraint, we use regulation as our constraint. And who controls regulation except the very companies that are being regulated? So somehow divesting ourselves of our moral fabric, what makes us human, what makes us happy, not taking into consideration conscience as being part of our day-to-day obligation, because the religion of our economic framework doesn't require it, right? Our economic framework only requires us to uphold the letter of the law, not the intention. And it doesn't require us to have any greater conscience than what the regulation states, because we might be penalized in the marketplace for having lower returns. So these are a couple more examples that are part of our society. Planned obsolescence, convenience consumption. These are perfect elements to a GDP economy because you constantly have to reproduce them. You need more and more of them. But the part that's missing in all of these is the extraction impact and the disposal impact. One simple place to pause and just sit back and think to yourself when we think about ourselves, and we're propagandize this a lot about how progressed an economy we are, how much more advanced we are than those predecessor periods of 200-300 years ago. You cannot dig any hole where those civilizations existed and pull out dirty diapers. But you will be able to do that to remember us. We have plastic pollution in our landfills. We just put it out of sight. We bury trash, which is what was done for we don't know how long, but at least for a very long time beforehand. But it was biodegradable trash. Our trash is unbiodegradable and we still bury it. You see a disconnect there in terms of progress? I mean, a progressed individual should be able to understand that you're burying something that's never going to break down. So just in terms of going back to the US responsibility, I know most of you are familiar with this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. And I mentioned earlier that the footprint in the US is very significant. If you look at the very top graph right here, what you'll see is that is a cumulative carbon emissions attributable to the United States. It's almost twice as great as the next country, which is China. And this is what's important here, is to not think about, you'll have people argue, well, China is exceeding on a per capita basis, or China has more absolute emissions this year. It doesn't really matter. We're talking about something that has a 500 to 1,000 year half-life, and we need to look at it cumulatively, right? And so when we look over here and we see the ice core data, we can see how, if you look where that line starts to go up, I always like to refer to this as looking at when we have made a GDP expenditure-based economy standard on a global scale. That happens around 1942. And that's pretty much about the same time as the UNFCCC says that global climate change started to push as fast as it did. If you look at the dates, it'll pretty much line up too. And it doesn't mean anything except the fact that that was the goal. If production-based economy is the goal and the only mechanism of furthering production is energy use, and you're going to look for the cheapest energy use because you're trying to reduce your costs, then that would make total sense. What if our goal had just been well-being? What if it had just been about making sure that we had strong local economies, Adam Smith type economies, where we knew the baker, we knew, I don't eat meat, so I'm not going to say butcher. We knew the gardener or the person who was growing the vegetables. We were interconnected. Your welfare mattered to me just as much as my welfare matters to you. It'd be a totally different system. And you know, the funny thing is, if you look back, any of you who have an interest, look back to 1979 at Jimmy Carter's so-called Culture of Malaise speech, State of the Union speech he gave in July. And he basically says the same thing now. When he's speaking, that's about 30 plus years off the international metric. But he makes a very clear point in that speech of saying we have become a nation of consumers and we value ourselves by what we have, not by who we are. We used to take pride in having strong families, and now we take pride in having things. And it's a very important speech, first of all, because we've not had a president speak to us as an American people like that since, but even more so because it's very connected to the changes he was seeing happening around him. But right after Jimmy Carter, we have the golden years of Ronald Reagan, where we didn't think about pollution anymore, right? We didn't think about anything, those of us that didn't have to. So let me just go through this slide fairly quickly. This slide is really economics. Most people don't recognize it, but it really is. Right through here, extraction of raw materials. If I took into consideration the ecosystem impact and the biodiversity loss at the point of extraction, and I priced that in, I told you at the beginning of our discussion that prices are only indicative of who is a stronger exploitive element. Well, nature cannot speak for herself. So therefore, extraction, we never pay for those resources, right? Then we go through product design and production. That's where you really need sustainability. The product designer determines so much in terms of the packaging. The packaging, distribution, use, and maintenance. This is the other part that's really interesting. We assume that products are safe to consume. Bottled water is the perfect example, right? People think that it's a safe thing, plastic bottled water, anything in plastic. But we know increasingly those people who are paying attention that plastic products, especially things that are heated, that are in plastic, are very harmful to the consumer. In fact, that's where that one credit card worth of consumption weekly is coming from. And then disposal, I've already touched on disposal in terms of landfills. The reason why disposal is not taken into consideration is because we have so much excess land and we just can bury. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the process of landfilling, but it's basically a deep hole that is lined with plastic. The trash is put on top, and then it's lined with plastic again. Incineration sludge is whatever's left over from the incinerator is put into those landfills. Those have to be pumped because those are high toxic elements that are usually left over in the incinerator. And those are oftentimes pumped eventually into the ocean. It's really an interesting cycle when you think about it, because in every way it touches all the things that we say that we hold dear, that we want to protect. But it's all coming out of our consumption choices. There's a great film, if any of you have had a chance to watch it, I'm happy for that, but those of you who haven't, Plastic China. Some of you are aware that in 2017, the China National Sword Policy went into effect, which basically eliminated the export market for plastic to China, which in that year and in 2018, states all over, communities all over the United States were scrambling to figure out what they were going to do with their plastic trash and their trash altogether. Well, the reason why I bring that up is in that film you can see very clearly how dealing with this particular product reduces the lifespan of these people. That film came out before the Chinese National Sword Policy. It's difficult to know if that really influenced the policy, but I'm assuming that there's probably some connect there. So I already said this to you, the prices reflect exploitation, and I've also noted that proxy becomes the goal. And those are the 2 points I really hope to bring home to you. This is where I really want you to think about. So what we have in a society today is this desire to go to so-called green fuels. They are no more better than using fossil fuels. Because anything in excess will have some adverse consequence that we have yet to understand. And the lack of using this precautionary mentality is the biggest problem that we have in our economy already. So these are just some examples. The most easily accessible reason for this was what happens at the end of life to these products. They are not designed to be reused or repurposed. They are designed to be put into a landfill. But to call this sustainable energy neglects the very fact that there's a life cycle behind it. It also doesn't take into consideration the fact that we do not know the full impact on other species and ourselves. We continue to deploy technologies, and you've all noted this with regard to the cell phone already, that we don't even know the full generational impact of. There are these AirPods that students wear all the time. The first time I ever saw them on campus, I thought it was because a whole bunch of people had ear infections. They were draining their ears. But one of my student groups did a life cycle assessment, and one of the most interesting things that they found is that those particular products interfere with human systems' ability to eliminate earwax, which can over time actually cause more damage than people understand. But we don't have enough information, so we can't really know, because it's not a particular point in time that determines the harm that's done to a person, right? Something over time. Also, each one of our systems is the reason why we've had so many problems with any kind of solutions legally that we seek with regard to human bodies, because each body is different, and the amount of other toxins and things that they come into contact with is unknown and uncertain. Okay, so I'm going to leave with this slide and then go to a couple really quick slides, because I've talked to you about a whole lot of problems, but I'd like to give you a couple solutions. So we are learning that with all these problems that I've noted, which are very few and very simple when you get to the core, it's really just about critically engaging in why you do what you do, giving yourself room to pause and reflect on what you want out of your life, seeing if you're aligning, with those beliefs that you hold dear with your day-to-day actions. And also perhaps maybe giving yourself a little bit more importance and recognizing you are the history that other people will be living. So in other words, your contribution today is so much more than you might recognize. Each one of us is an example for someone else, at least one other person, maybe even much more so than that. And as I mentioned earlier, we are at a tipping point where there's so much information available that it's hard not to know that changes are needed. So this picture right here is just of grassroots movements. So grassroots movements, we know, are taking off on a global scale. And why are they important? Oftentimes people will say, well, the corporation needs to change, or the government needs more regulation. So I'm going to talk to you about this very briefly. First of all, you probably all know the Margaret Mead quote, never doubt that a small group of people can make a change because they're the only ones that ever have. Well, it's the truth. Every time you see changes happen for the best, it's because small groups of people have been working to make those changes over time. And grassroots movements recognize that you have to have people who understand the issue. If you impose a regulation on people, but they don't understand what the rationale is for that regulation, they will circumvent the regulation, abide by the letter of it, to maintain the quality of life or whatever outcome they had expected without it. Because they don't understand the intent, they haven't bought into the intent, you have not engaged with them as a stakeholder to make them part of this larger outcome that you want to create. Corporations have a fiduciary responsibility, primarily because of the neoclassical school of economics and Milton Friedman, to focus on profits. That's why corporate social responsibility reporting has been coming up, because it's actually the movement to promote conscience in a conscienceless entity. You can't force a corporation to do something that's inconsistent with its fiduciary responsibility. All you're going to do is cause them to be non-competitive with their peers, and unless you are willing to give them a brand premium for that change, right? So in other words, those corporations that are willing to step out and move forward are getting a brand premium because they have a group of people that are willing to foster them, either consume or invest or both, based on the fact that they are putting those changes in place. But for other corporations that are in highly competitive markets, it's not going to happen. You have to change fiduciary responsibility itself. So this is the argument that I would have, is that there are annual meetings of shareholders for every public company. Instead of divesting, collaborate with other like-minded entities. I used to be an investor relations officer before I came back to academics, and so I had to deal with activist shareholders. You get together as a block of activist shareholders, you can force the company to change what it defines as fiduciary responsibility. You can change the compensation metrics of the senior management team so it incorporates sustainability or operationalized metrics related to it. But if you divest, you're making yourself feel good by doing nothing. So I really hope that will be some food for thought to think about. So other last thing is, if we look back historically with regard to regulation in government, and this is also the fear that's been there with regard to the Supreme Court on a few different occasions now, we recognize that people carry their own values, and when you elect people into office, you're electing their values. And their values are going to be what affects the decisions they make. So to the extent that we choose not to vote based on what we understand for a candidate, but how many signs they have or how many ads they have, we are complicit in the one mechanism that we have for change that's easily accessible to us, especially on the local level, of not taking it, right? So my argument is it's all based on the individual. So let me go quickly through these slides. My organization is called Sustainable Practices, and we started what we call the Commercial Single-Use Plastic Bottle Ban campaign. We use a life cycle method of evaluating to promote economic literacy, as I started off with at the very beginning, and talked about all the different stages from extraction, consumption, to disposal. And then we created a bylaw. The state of Massachusetts, we have citizens petitions, which we can file in every town. There are 15 towns across Cape Cod. We filed these citizens petitions in each town. And we followed the rules that we needed to have in terms of an enforcement vehicle in order to make sure that if it got passed, the Attorney General's office would uphold it. We did pass. We started off first in 2019 with the Municipal Plastic Bottle Ban, which got adopted across all 15 towns. Municipal Ban effectively eliminates town government purchase of single-use plastic bottle beverages of any kind, and in some towns, the sale of beverages in single-use plastic containers on town property. All 15 towns have that in effect. We started in 2020 with the commercial ban right when COVID hit, so we had to postpone most of our votes to fall. We actually passed in 11 towns. We had 3 of them rescinded. So that's why we're at 8. But these have been now in effect over a year. So we are going to be going after the other 7, and hopefully we will get those. Now this might seem like low-hanging fruit, but it is an educational platform where we can explain to people that this is a petroleum-based product. It has impacts in terms of human health and environmental impacts as well. But more than anything else, even if you're trying to look for substitutes, you need to think reusable, because any product, just like looking at the solar fields and the wind plantations, will have an impact when you use so much resource to create it. So what the fundamental truth is that each of us is a consumer, an investor, and a voter. So it's important for us to take these three different silos that we all hold and work together if we actually are going to look to combat climate change, but also if we're looking to reduce the human footprint. So this is the foundation of economic thought. If we actually look at the real cultural attributions that we could have adopted, how selfish soever a man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. That means that we actually enjoy seeing each other happy. We are naturally cooperative. That is our state. It is time that we start to take off and make that into a reality in terms of how we choose to live with one another. And even though the title said climate change, and I didn't directly tie every aspect to climate change, I hope you can see where I was meaning to go there. It's more than greenhouse gases, because it's going to be plastics too. Because when the fossil fuel industries don't have places to go with the fossil fuels directly, then the plastics become even more important, which we already know is starting to happen. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for that talk. We unfortunately don't have time for questions because we need to give folks a minute or two to get to their next class, but thank you for your presentation. And to those that are joining us online and in the room, our next talk will take place on Tuesday of next week at 12 o'clock. So we'll see you then. Thank you.